I've always had a complicated relationship with this city. Some days, I see Cailton for what it could be, a beacon of hope, an example of resilience. Other days, it feels like a slow sinkhole, dragging its inhabitants into the muck of systemic corruption and apathy. This morning, though, I didn't have time for philosophical musings. My alarm blared at precisely 6:30 a.m., tearing me from a fitful sleep. A dream lingered in the recesses of my mind, something about standing on a crumbling ledge, the wind roaring in my ears as I tried to maintain balance. Fitting. I rolled out of bed, my thoughts already fixed on the day's minor inconvenience. A parking ticket. A damn parking ticket. The irony wasn't lost on me, a federal prosecutor spending his morning in municipal court, disputing a $75 citation for parking in a restricted zone. It wasn't about the money. It never was. For me, it was principle, and maybe, just maybe, it was about control in a world that so often left me feeling powerless. After a shower and a rushed breakfast, a banana and a half cup of lukewarm coffee, I suited up. Charcoal gray today, conservative, respectable. I chose a tie in muted blue, something that whispered competence without shouting arrogance. The mirror reflected a man of 37 years, sharp-eyed and deliberate. The lines around my eyes betrayed long nights and heavy cases, but the determination in them remained unyielding. By 7:15 a.m., I was in my car, the sleek black sedan slicing through Cailton's uneven streets. The car was an indulgence, my one concession to vanity. Everything else in my life was pragmatic, my neatly arranged apartment, my predictable routines, my guarded relationships. As I approached the municipal courthouse, a squat, unremarkable building on Cailton's east side, I couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. Something about the day felt off. It wasn't the parking ticket. It was deeper, an itch at the base of my spine that warned me the ground beneath my feet was shifting. The courthouse smelled of linoleum and bureaucracy. Its walls were a sickly beige, adorned with faded posters about civic duty and legal rights. The waiting room was already buzzing with people, an eclectic mix of faces etched with irritation, resignation, or quiet desperation. My name was called at 9:05 a.m., precisely 5 minutes past my scheduled time. I stepped into the courtroom, the familiar weight of public scrutiny settling over me like an old coat. The judge, Garrett Harlow, sat at the bench, his imposing figure framed by the American flag and a plaque reading, "In Justice We Trust." I'd heard of Harlow before. He had a reputation for being unforgiving, almost tyrannical. He ruled his courtroom with an iron fist, taking pleasure in making examples of those who dared to challenge him. "Mr. Emerson Ward," Harlow intoned, his voice a mix of gravel and disdain. "Approach the bench." I moved forward, presenting my case with the practiced calm of someone who had spent a decade in the legal trenches. "Your Honor, I'm here to contest a parking citation issued on December 5th. I have photographic evidence showing that the signage was, 'Stop.'" Harlow's interruption was sharp, almost violent. His eyes, cold and calculating, pinned me in place. "Do you think this courtroom is here to cater to your whims, Mr. Ward?" The room went silent. My pulse quickened, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply—" "Let me tell you something," he cut in, leaning forward. "This court doesn't tolerate arrogance. You may think your fancy title as a federal prosecutor gives you special privileges, but in this room, you're just another defendant." The words were a slap. I could feel the eyes of the gallery boring into me, a mix of curiosity and pity. I had anticipated resistance, but this was personal. Before I could respond, Harlow's gavel came down with a crack. "This court finds you in contempt. You will pay a fine of $500. The air was sucked from the room. A murmur rippled through the gallery, but Harlow silenced it with a glare. My mind raced, calculating my next move. Do I argue? Do I appeal? Or do I let this moment pass and regroup later? "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath the surface, but I wasn't finished. As I returned to my seat, I pulled out my phone. With deliberate movements, I typed a message to my team at the Northern District office. The subject line was simple: incident report, judicial misconduct. My hands shook slightly as I hit send. It wasn't fear, it was adrenaline. I'd faced down organized crime syndicates and corrupt politicians, but this was different. This wasn't just about me, it was about the system. When my name was called again, I stood with newfound resolve. This time, I carried my badge in my hand, the emblem of the Department of Justice gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. Before we proceed, I'd like to formally introduce myself. I am Emerson Ward, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern Judicial District. Harlow's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough. The smug superiority in his eyes flickered, replaced by something akin to unease. The gallery stirred, whispers spreading like wildfire. And I'd like to address the $500 fine you've issued, I continued, my tone calm but unyielding, not because of the amount, but because of what it represents. Harlow leaned back, his facade cracking. I suggest you tread carefully, Mr. Ward. Or what? I countered, stepping closer to the bench. You'll hold me in contempt again? Add another fine? Go ahead, Your Honor. But know this, I've already documented today's proceedings and my office will be reviewing your conduct. Part 2. The battle lines the courtroom was buzzing. Garrett Harlow, the stoic judge who had controlled this room like a puppet master for years, was now visibly flustered. His gavel, an emblem of his authority, sat unused as he tried to compose himself. For a moment, I thought he might issue another fine or find some way to escalate his power play. Instead, he sat back, his expression like a gambler who had just realized he was holding a losing hand. Mr. Ward, he began, his voice sharper than before. This courtroom operates under the law, not intimidation. If you wish to file a formal complaint, you're free to do so. But until then, you will abide by this court's ruling. He tried to sound authoritative, but his words carried an undertone of retreat. I could feel the tide turning. He was no longer in control of the narrative, and everyone in the room knew it. As I returned to my seat, the older man in the back row caught my eye again. His face was calm, almost serene, but his gaze was piercing. There was something about him that felt familiar, though I couldn't place it. As the courtroom session adjourned and people began to file out, he approached me. You handled yourself well in there, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Thanks, I replied, extending my hand. Emerson Ward. Frank Dunley, he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. I used to work in this courthouse, a long time ago. His words piqued my interest. As a lawyer? Bailiff, he replied. 15 years. I've seen a lot of things in this courtroom. Some of them don't sit right with me. His eyes carried the weight of decades spent in the system, watching its gears grind down the powerless. Harlow's got a reputation, Frank continued. You're not the first person he's tried to put in their place. And I'm guessing I won't be the last, I said, but I'm not going to let it slide. Frank nodded approvingly. Good, because people like him don't change unless they're forced to. By the time I returned to my office, word of the incident had already started to spread. It wasn't just a matter of local gossip. Within hours, my colleagues at the Northern Judicial District were calling, emailing, and even stopping by my office to ask about what had happened. You went head-to-head with Garrett Harlow? Asked Michelle Rivers, a senior prosecutor with a no-nonsense attitude. Are you insane? Maybe, I replied with a wry smile, but I'm not wrong. Michelle sighed, folding her arms. Look, I get it. Harlow's a tyrant, and he's been skating by on his reputation for years. But you need to be careful. Judges don't like being challenged, and they have long memories. I'm not afraid of Harlow, I said, leaning back in my chair. What I'm afraid of is letting people like him continue to abuse their power. Michelle gave me a long look, then nodded. Just watch your back. This could get messy. That night, I began digging into Harlow's history. Court records, public complaints, anything I could find. It didn't take long to uncover a pattern. Over the past decade, Harlow had issued disproportionately harsh fines and penalties to defendants from marginalized communities. Cases involving Black, Latino, and immigrant defendants were resolved more quickly, but with stiffer sentences. Meanwhile, white defendants with similar charges often received leniency. It wasn't just anecdotal, it was statistical. The numbers painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. But I needed more than numbers. I needed witnesses, evidence, something that could stand up to scrutiny. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse with a plan. Talked to Frank Dunley. He had seen Harlow in action for years, and I was sure he had stories to tell. But as I stepped into the building, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The usual hum of activity was replaced by something heavier, more charged. Ward, a voice called. It was Michelle, rushing toward me with a look of urgency. You need to see this. She handed me her phone. On the screen was a breaking news alert. Local judge under fire for alleged bias in courtroom. The story detailed my confrontation with Harlow, complete with quotes from anonymous sources who claimed the judge had a history of discriminatory rulings. How did this get out? I asked, my mind racing. Michelle shrugged. I have no idea. But it's out there now, and people are paying attention. The news was spreading fast. Social media was ablaze with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and #HarlowExposed. People were sharing their own experiences, recounting stories of unfair treatment in Harlow's courtroom. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. The spotlight was now shining brightly on Cailton's justice system and on me. By noon, I received my first warning shot. An email arrived from an anonymous sender containing a single sentence, "Watch your step, Ward." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. It wasn't just a threat, it was a confirmation that I had stirred up something bigger than I'd anticipated. Later that day, a junior attorney in my office, Marcus Hale, approached me hesitantly. "Hey, Emerson," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I overheard something in the courthouse break room. Some of Harlow's buddies are talking about shutting this whole thing down." "What do you mean?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I mean they're going to try to discredit you, maybe dig up something from your past, make you look bad. They're not going to play fair." That evening, as I was reviewing my notes, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Is this Emerson Ward?" a voice asked, low and cautious. "Yes," I replied. "Who's this?" "I can't tell you my name," the voice said, "but I have information about Judge Harlow. I worked in his courtroom for 5 years, and I saw things that shouldn't have happened. I want to help." The call was brief, but the stranger promised to send me a file containing key evidence, emails, recordings, and internal memos that could expose the full extent of Harlow's misconduct. It was exactly what I needed, but it also raised the stakes. The anonymous tip came through later that night, just as promised. The file was encrypted and sent via a secure link, along with a short note. "This is just the beginning." My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, unsure of what I was about to uncover. Inside were damning pieces of evidence against Harlow, emails between the judge and a small circle of courthouse staff, detailing discussions about setting an example for certain defendants. The language was careful, but the intent was clear. One email referred to a defendant as just another statistic, while another suggested tightening the screws on repeat offenders. It was subtle, insidious, and it aligned perfectly with the patterns I'd seen in his rulings. But there was more. Among the files was an audio recording. It was scratchy but audible, capturing a private conversation between Harlow and someone I couldn't identify. In it, Harlow's voice dripped with contempt as he described a defendant as a walking stereotype who needed to be put in his place. My stomach churned. This wasn't just misconduct, it was outright bigotry. The next morning, I met with Michelle in my office. The evidence spread across my desk like a battlefield map. "This is it," I said, my voice firm. "This is what we need to take him down." Michelle scanned the documents, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Jesus, Emerson," she muttered. "This isn't just about Harlow, is it? This is systemic." "I know," I replied, "and we're going to expose all of it." Michelle looked at me sharply. "You realize what you're stepping into, right? If this goes public, it's not just Harlow who'll come after you. You'll have the entire system fighting to protect itself." "I'm not afraid of them," I said, though the truth was more complicated. Fear wasn't the absence of danger, it was the decision to act despite it. By noon, the pushback began. I received a call from a senior administrator in the district court, someone I'd worked with for years. She was curt and professional, but her words carried an undeniable edge. "Emerson, I've been hearing about your activities regarding Judge Harlow," she said. "I understand your frustration, but I strongly advise you to reconsider pursuing this matter further." "Reconsider?" I asked, my voice tightening. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that it's in everyone's best interest to let this go. Harlow may have his faults, but he's been a pillar of this court for decades. Stirring the pot won't end well for anyone." I hung up without responding. The message was clear. The system would protect itself, no matter the cost. That evening, as I reviewed the evidence again, Michelle burst into my office, her face pale and her eyes wide with alarm. "We've got a problem," she said, tossing a folder onto my desk. Inside were printed copies of emails, my emails. They'd been taken out of context, twisted to make it look like I'd mishandled a high-profile case years ago. Where did this come from? I demanded. They're circulating it, Michelle said. Harlow's people, probably. They're trying to discredit you before you can discredit him. My pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a direct attack on my career, my reputation, everything I'd built. But what stung the most was the realization that someone in my own office must have leaked these emails. Someone I trusted. As the storm around me grew, I received an unexpected call from Frank Dunley, the retired bailiff who had approached me in the courtroom. Ward, he said, his voice steady. I heard about the emails. They're trying to shake you, but don't let them. I appreciate the encouragement, Frank, I said. But I'm not sure words are going to cut it. They won't, he replied. That's why I've got something better. Frank invited me to his modest home on the outskirts of Caleton. His living room was small but meticulously organized, with shelves full of old books and framed photographs of his family. On the coffee table sat a battered leather briefcase. This, he said, opening it, is my insurance policy. Inside were notebooks, transcripts, and handwritten notes, records Frank had kept during his years as a bailiff. They detailed years of Harlow's questionable rulings, his disparaging remarks, and even instances where he had allegedly manipulated case outcomes. I couldn't do anything back then, Frank said, his voice heavy with regret. But I can do something now, and so can you. Armed with Frank's records and the anonymous evidence, I contacted a journalist I trusted, Elena Marquez, an investigative reporter known for her fearless exposés. When I handed her the files, her eyes lit up with a mix of shock and determination. This is explosive, she said. You realize this could bring down more than just Harlow, right? This could shake the entire judicial system in Caleton. That's the idea, I replied. Within days, Elena's article was published. The headline was damning: Justice on Trial, Allegations of Systemic Bias in Caleton's Courts. The story detailed Harlow's misconduct, supported by concrete evidence. It included interviews with former defendants, Frank's testimony, and an analysis of the court's sentencing patterns. The fallout was immediate. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, demanding Harlow's resignation. Social media was flooded with personal stories from people who had suffered under the system's inequities. The pressure was mounting, and Harlow's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Harlow called an emergency press conference, flanked by his legal team. He denied the allegations, calling them baseless and a coordinated attack against his character. But as he spoke, his voice wavered, his confidence slipping. Meanwhile, I was summoned to testify before a judicial review board. It was the culmination of everything: the evidence, the backlash, the sacrifices. As I sat before the panel, I felt the weight of every person who had been silenced by the system. What do you hope to achieve with this? One of the board members asked me. Change, I said simply. Real change. Part 4, Aftermath. The review board's decision came swiftly. Judge Garrett Harlow was officially suspended pending further investigation, and a public inquiry was launched into his courtroom practices. The ruling made headlines across Caleton, and for a brief moment, it felt like justice had prevailed. But victories like this are never simple. The day after the suspension, I sat in my office, sifting through the mountain of emails and messages that had poured in. Some were supportive, former defendants thanking me for standing up, lawyers who had battled similar biases sharing their own stories. But many were hostile, thinly veiled threats from anonymous senders, warning me to back off. One email stood out. It came from a blocked address, the subject line reading simply, "It's bigger than you think." The message contained a single sentence: Harlow is just the surface, dig deeper. I forwarded the email to Michelle, who arrived in my office within minutes, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. You think this is legit? She asked. Maybe, I said, leaning back in my chair. If it's true, we need to figure out what's underneath all of this. Michelle sighed, running a hand through her hair. Emerson, we just took down one of the most powerful judges in the city. Do you really want to poke the bear again? Do we have a choice? I asked. If there's more to this, we can't ignore it. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told me she agreed. Whether we liked it or not, we were already in too deep. Later that afternoon, a call came in from Elena Marquez, the journalist who had exposed Harlow. Her voice crackled with urgency. Emerson, I've been digging into the court's financial records, she said. There's something strange. Harlow's fines were disproportionately high compared to other judges. and a lot of that money seems to have disappeared. Disappeared? I asked, sitting up straighter. Funneled through third-party payment processors, Elena explained. The trail goes cold after that, but it's suspicious as hell. And get this, Harlow isn't the only judge involved. There's a pattern. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just about bias, it was about money, corruption at a systemic level, hidden behind the veneer of judicial authority. Send me everything you've got, I said. We're going to need a bigger board. As I delved deeper into the financial records, it became clear that someone in my office had been working against me. Internal memos I'd never seen before, detailing critical aspects of the investigation, had been leaked to the press. But the tone of these leaks wasn't supportive. They were framing me as reckless, implying I was jeopardizing the integrity of the office. Michelle barged into my office one evening, holding a stack of papers. "It's Marcus," she said, her voice tight. "He's the one leaking information." "Marcus Hale?" I asked, incredulous. He was a junior attorney, bright-eyed and eager when he'd joined the team. I'd mentored him, taught him everything I knew. "Why?" I asked, feeling a sharp pang of betrayal. Michelle hesitated. "I think he's being pressured, maybe by someone higher up." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If Marcus was compromised, it meant the corruption ran deeper than I'd imagined. That night, I stayed in the office long after everyone else had left. I combed through Elena's findings, Frank's records, and the anonymous evidence we'd collected. The patterns were undeniable: systematic overcharging of fines, disproportionately severe penalties for minorities, and a paper trail leading to a network of shell companies. The corruption wasn't confined to Harlow's courtroom. It spanned multiple judges, court clerks, and even private law firms. The system wasn't just broken, it was rigged. And then I found it, a name buried deep in one of the financial documents: James Faulkner. Faulkner was a retired judge, once considered the most powerful man in Cailton's judiciary. He had left the bench years ago under murky circumstances, but his influence still loomed large. If he was involved, this wasn't just corruption, it was an empire. The next day, I confronted Marcus in the office parking lot. He froze when he saw me, his usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "I know what you've been doing," I said, my voice cold. "Emerson, he began, but I cut him off. "Save it. Just tell me who's pulling your strings." Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Finally, he sighed. "Faulkner," he said quietly. "He approached me months ago, said he could help my career if I kept him informed." "And you believed him?" I asked, my voice rising. "I didn't have a choice," Marcus shot back. "Do you know what happens to people who go against him? He owns this city." The confrontation with Marcus left me reeling. Faulkner's reach was wider than I'd feared, and it was clear that exposing him would be far more dangerous than taking down Harlow. But I wasn't about to back down. Later that evening, as I reviewed my strategy, a knock at my apartment door startled me. When I opened it, I found Frank standing there, his expression grim. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. "There's something you don't know." "What is it?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Frank hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "Faulkner's not just protecting Harlow," he said finally. "He's protecting himself, and he's got dirt on everyone: judges, prosecutors, even cops. If you go after him, he'll come for you." "Let him," I said, my jaw tightening. "I'm not afraid of him." "You should be," Frank said darkly. "Because Faulkner doesn't just ruin careers, he ruins lives." Frank's warning only strengthened my resolve. I reached out to Elena, sharing everything I'd uncovered about Faulkner's network. She agreed to start investigating, but we both knew the risks. This wasn't just a story, it was a fight for survival. As we worked together, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Faulkner's empire wasn't just about money, it was about control. By manipulating the courts, he ensured that the powerful stayed powerful, and the vulnerable stayed voiceless. But then came another twist. Evidence of a murder covered up years ago, tied directly to Faulkner. The victim was a whistleblower, someone who had tried to expose the same corruption I was now uncovering. The stakes had just been raised. The evidence against Faulkner felt like a bomb waiting to go off. Elena had unearthed a decade-long history of manipulation, financial exploitation, and a string of suspicious deaths tied to whistleblowers and dissenters. But as we pieced together the full scope of Faulkner's empire, the enormity of the fight ahead loomed larger. "This isn't just about corruption," Elena said one evening, sitting across from me in my dimly lit office. "This is organized crime masquerading as justice. If we're going to take this public, we have to do it all at once. No leaks, no whispers. We need to blow the doors off." She was right. A gradual approach would leave too much room for retaliation. But the question wasn't whether we should act, it was how to survive when we did. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under my apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message: "Stop digging, or you'll end up like the others." It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. My hands shook as I read the words, the weight of the threat pressing down on me. I thought about the whistleblower Elena had mentioned, the one who had been silenced years ago. The parallels were impossible to ignore. I called Michelle immediately, my voice taut. "It's escalating," I said, recounting the note. "You need to be careful, Emerson," she said, her tone laced with concern. "This isn't just about your career anymore. These people will do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Then we need to move faster," I replied. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous it gets." That afternoon, I convened a meeting with my closest allies, Michelle, Elena, and Frank. We gathered in the back room of a quiet diner on the outskirts of Cailton, a place where prying eyes wouldn't follow. "We need to hit them from all angles," I said, laying out the strategy. "Elena's article will be the centerpiece, but we'll also file a formal complaint with the State Judicial Board. At the same time, we'll go public with the financial records, the recordings, and the testimonies." "And Faulkner?" Michelle asked. "What's the plan for him?" I hesitated, knowing how dangerous the next step would be. "We confront him directly. If we can get him to admit anything, on record, it's game over." Frank leaned forward, his expression grim. "Faulkner's no fool. He won't go down without a fight." "Then we make sure the fight isn't his to win," I said. 2 nights later, I arranged a meeting with James Faulkner. The pretense was simple. I wanted to talk. He agreed, likely confident that his reputation and resources made him untouchable. The meeting took place in a private room at one of Cailton's most exclusive clubs, a place that reeked of old money and quiet deals. Faulkner sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding. He was an older man, but there was nothing frail about him. His eyes were sharp, his movements deliberate. "Mr. Ward," he said, gesturing for me to sit, "I must admit I'm curious. What exactly do you hope to achieve with all this? Crusading?" I didn't take the seat. Instead, I stood opposite him, my arms crossed. "Justice," I said simply. "Real justice, not the kind you've been selling." Faulkner smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You're ambitious, I'll give you that. But ambition without strategy is just a recipe for failure. I have strategy," I said, my voice steady. "And evidence, enough to bring down everything you've built." For a moment his mask slipped, his expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ward. Do you really think you can win?" "I don't need to win," I replied. "I just need the truth to come out." As I left the meeting, I felt a strange sense of unease. Faulkner had been too calm, too confident. He hadn't tried to deny the allegations, nor had he threatened me outright. It was as if he knew something I didn't. The answer came the next morning. Michelle burst into my office, her face pale. "They're coming for you," she said breathlessly. "The state bar just filed a motion to suspend your license. They're claiming professional misconduct." My stomach dropped. "What?" "They're saying you mishandled cases, leaked confidential information, and violated ethical guidelines," she explained, handing me a copy of the motion. "It's Faulkner. He's using his connections to discredit you." The attack was surgical, designed to destroy my credibility before I could expose the truth, but I wasn't about to back down. Over the next 48 hours, we worked tirelessly to counter Faulkner's moves. Elena published her article, laying bare the extent of the corruption, while Michelle and I filed a counter motion with the state bar, providing evidence of Faulkner's interference. Frank went on record, sharing his first-hand accounts of the judge's misconduct. But the real breakthrough came when Elena uncovered a key piece of evidence, a hidden recording from years ago, capturing Faulkner discussing how to handle troublesome individuals. The recording implicated not just Faulkner, but several other powerful figures in Cailton's judiciary. We released the recording publicly, ensuring it couldn't be buried or discredited. The fallout was immediate and explosive. Within days, Faulkner's empire began to crumble. Protests erupted outside the courthouse, demanding accountability. The The Judicial Review Board launched an independent investigation, and several judges and court officials were suspended. Faulkner himself was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. The threats against me didn't stop, but they became less coordinated, more desperate. It was clear that Faulkner's network was unraveling, and with it, his ability to control the narrative. 6 months later, Faulkner was formally indicted on charges of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. His trial became a national spectacle, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to decades in prison. The reforms that followed were sweeping. New oversight committees were established, mandatory bias training was implemented for judges and court staff, and a whistleblower protection program was introduced. As for me, I emerged from the battle scarred but determined. My license was reinstated, my reputation restored, but more importantly, I had proven that even the most entrenched systems of corruption could be challenged and defeated. Cailton changed in the months and years that followed. It wasn't perfect, no city ever is, but it was better. The courthouse felt lighter, its halls no longer echoing with the weight of unchecked power. One evening, as I sat in my office, I received a letter from a young law student. It read simply, "Thank you for showing us that the system can change. You've given us hope." And in that moment, I realized something. The fight for justice is never over, but it's a fight worth having.